Good evening, everyone. Hi, thank you for joining us tonight. I'd like to go ahead and start the presentation and the meeting tonight in regards to airport PFAS, providing you with an update of background of where we've been and what we're doing to respond to PFAS. My name is Katie Service. I am the airport manager. With me tonight is Matt Elia, the assistant airport manager, Dan Santos, director of DPW, and Brian Massa with Horsley Witten Group. He's the airport's consultant that has been assisting us in the PFAS response. The purpose of tonight's meeting is basically additional outreach, providing our community with an update on our PFAS response for the airport. We completed a similar outreach meeting back in September of 2022, and we're back here today to provide some additional information and to provide you with an overall update of what we have done thus far. The meeting is not a requirement of the Public Involvement Plan, the PIP. It is an extra outreach meeting to respond to requests for additional information on the mitigation efforts that the airport has made. We will go over our plan and final resolution and next steps. PFAS information will also be provided on our website. Let me just go to the next slide. The PFAS website is listed at the first bullet. If you go to flyhya.com, airport information, and then there's a PFAS page that's dedicated to our response to PFAS. Although not discussed tonight will be the ongoing environmental assessment in the airport master plan. Tonight is only to discuss our PFAS and give you an update on that. But I also provided the project website for the EA and the airport master plan projects. The next meeting is scheduled for October 18th. We will have both a virtual meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, followed by an in-person meeting in this building at 6 o'clock. So I just wanted to post that for you. I'll go back to this in one moment. I know some of you are taking down some notes. Just wanted to show you where it was on our website. So if you go to flyhya.com and you go over to airport information in the upper right, you can scroll down to PFAS or environmental assessment, and that will get you all of the information that has been posted to the public to date. Any questions or comments? Does anybody want me to go back to that previous slide? Okay. All right, so tonight, Brian Massa with Horsley Witten Group is going to walk through the presentation. It's going to highlight how the process started for the airport, the analysis that has been completed, the results of that analysis, the impacts from other non-airport industrial sites that are located north of the airport, and then, of course, our next steps and final solution. During the presentation, Brian will take questions from the audience. We just want it to be an open, flowing meeting. If for some reason your question might be covered in a slide that's further on in the presentation, we'll note that and we'll get back to you when we get to that position in the slide deck. The meeting is intended to be informational. It's intended to bring you up to speed to where we are with our PFAS response. And we hope that you have questions for Brian and myself. But with that being said, I'd like to turn everything over to Brian so he can start the presentation. I do have a microphone here, so if somebody does have a question, please raise your hand. I'll go over to you with the microphone so you can ask the question, but also so everybody else can hear the comment or the question that's being asked. Okay, Brian?
All right, thank you, Katie. Welcome, everybody. As Katie said, this is going to be informal, so please, if you have a question, just raise your hand. Katie can come over with the microphone, and we'll have an open discussion about it. Do you want me to leave this up for a second? If you have any questions, you can email any of us, Katie Service, the airport manager, Matt Elia, and then myself. I'll leave that slide up for a few seconds. All right, so for today's discussion, we're going to do some general details on PFAS. The PFAS at the airport is related to aqueous film-forming foam, also known as AFFF. We're going to do a general timeline on how this all started, the investigation that the airport's done, and kind of where we are to date. I'll discuss the nature and extent of PFAS impacts that we have at the airport, as well as the impacts that we found outside of the airport that are related to non-airport sources. We'll also discuss the caps that we installed as a PFAS mitigation method back in 2020. We'll also discuss PFAS plume modeling, which is how we depicted where the plume is going to go over time. And then we'll discuss the next steps that we're going to do. So the first slide in here, I just kind of wanted to have as a general discussion point and give kind of a quick background on what we've discovered during our investigation, as well as the extent of the plumes. So let me try to use the laser pointer here. So the airport installed numerous soil borings and monitoring wells. They're probably hard to see right here, but we identified 2 PFAS plumes during the course of the investigation, or actually 3 PFAS plumes. The first plume is shown up here, and it's coming onto the airport from a hydraulically up gradient source, kind of coming down this way, diverging on the Mar wells, which is down here. It's kind of depicted in this cyan color. The second plume that we identified is from the Barnstable Fire Training Academy. That's this plume that's shown up in magenta that's going down this way, also going to the Marwell area. And then the third plume is this guy right here, and this is the projected maximum extent of the airport's plume. As of last year, the plumes just hit Marwells. We identified it in Marwell 2 based on forensics analysis, which I'll kind of get into play. One of the things that we found during this investigation was that everywhere that we drilled, whether it was hydraulically up gradient of the airport, cross gradient, down gradient, there was PFAS in there. And that kind of points to the ongoing issue that there's these multiple sources of PFAS that are kind of everywhere. So we needed to figure out a way to distinguish it. And we did that through the environmental forensics that I'll discuss later on. So what is PFAS? PFAS is considered an emerging contaminant. There's not a whole lot of information about it. We're still trying to determine the full extent of the risk. It's a man-made fluorine-containing chemical. It's water, grease, and stain resistant, and it's also resistant to breakdown, which is why it's called the forever chemical. It's extremely persistent in the environment, and it's extremely mobile in groundwater. So Mass DEP currently regulates 6 PFAS analytes. There's thousands of PFAS analytes right now. Current methods can run for about 40 of them, and Mass DEP is currently regulating 6. The 6 that they're regulating is based on risk assessment data. These are the 6 that are right up there. The sum of 6 is what we call for the 6 summing of them, and that's what's regulated in groundwater. And in soil, they regulate each one of them individually. For the airport's reports, you'll see on our reports that we call sum of 6, which is the regulated analyte list, total PFAS, which is the sum of all laboratory-reported PFAS analytes, and then 6,2-fluorotolymer. 6,2-fluorotolymer. So for groundwater, you sum up all of the concentrations for those 6 individual compounds right there. So every detection that you have for those 6 that are up there, the PFDA, PFHPA, PFHX. So it's the sum of these 6 right here for groundwater. So when we run the
What is groundwater? I don't understand what groundwater is. I'm being serious. What is the definition of groundwater?
So groundwater is the water table water out here. So when you drill through the soil and you go down, 20, 30 feet or so, you come into the groundwater. That's what's traveling with the contamination, and that's where the water is extracted for drinking water purposes.
Brian, follow up on Benny's question. Is the groundwater the same as the aquifer? Are the two different?
There's different portions of the aquifer. So there's a shallow groundwater extent. The contamination out here extends to about 110 feet or so, maybe even a little bit different, deeper than that. The drinking water that's being extracted from the Mar wells is about 70 to 80 feet below grade, and that's the area that it's pulling out from the drinking water aquifer.
So the aquifer does go through the airport property?
Yes.
Thank you.
And rainwater that falls on the ground is rolling along and being absorbed into that?
Yes. Any more questions?
Can you just back up to that area that you defined as this guy
Yes. Yep, so that plume is extending right down to here. So the yellow one is the estimated extent of the airport's PFAS plume. This one that you see in cyan that continues past it, that's a totally separate plume not related to the airport. Yes. Yep, the town of Yarmouth is on our public involvement plan, but this isn't a public involvement plan meeting, but they are. They get notices every time that there's a report available for comment. Welcome.
The left side, you said you have the plume coming from that looks like the west, onto the property. It looks like coming across where the, terminal is.
Right up here?
Yeah, farther up, you said that there is a plume up there.
It's off airport property. So up here, we have monitoring wells in the industrial park that's off airport property. There's PFAS there. There's PFAS down here off airport property. Basically, everywhere that we've drilled, there's PFAS. So there's multiple PFAS sources that are all converging down at the Mar wells.
Oh, have you done any testing near the Cape Bay or Hanger, across towards the Nile wells? Because that's where originally the plume, well, we didn't, I was on the Yarmouth. We saw, there was a plume that emanated from Cape Bay Hanger moving east, right across the old terminal. So there's been testing for PFAS in that area.
There's been testing all over the airport for PFAS, and we've only identified 2 locations where there's been a PFAS release. This little area right here, that's what we call the Airport Rescue and Firefighting Building area. That's where PFAS was stored in the AFFF firefighting foam. And then also up here, which is the deployment area, which is where PFAS was sprayed.
One more question.
Sure.
Down where the Nile wells are, your pumping stations east of that. There is, the Nile wells are part of what I, as a kid growing up, called a swamp. It's all grown over with vegetation today. Those on Route 28 coming into Hyannis, it's where the, 54 Baker Square. On the right. Have you done any testing into Yarmouth in regards to, that area, which leads over to where the Mill Pond, where the, waterfall is? Have you done any testing there?
No, we've done our testing up to the Mar wells because we've been able to model the extent of our plume. So we've tracked our plume from up to here to here. Now it's right here. The maximum extent of it is going to be right there. By the time our plume hits here, it's less than the regulatory standards.
Have you gone any further east?
No.
Account for, if you're talking both of those yellow sites.
I'm considering the same plume from the airport. It's, yes, you're correct. It's 2 separate plumes, but this is the airport's plume right there, right there.
So the one on the left hasn't moved that far? Is that what-
No, it's very small. So the maximum extent of that plume is right here. So that's staying stable, and that's sitting right there. This is the maximum extent that it'll get to. This one right here is the airport's major source plume.
So why is it not moved?
Because it's going to dilute out.
Yes, just a quick question that, if you could possibly explain how, you approach the methodology of the shape of that lower end of the plume. The particular concern that I have is I had, to try to prepare, looked up to see where the testing was in. And as you just stated, it doesn't appear that southerly or easterly of the plume as you delineated, that there's been any testing. And I think a lot of people have asked me that question is, how do you know that that's the shape of the plume if you haven't really done any testing down in the Yarmouth piece below?
Because I have monitoring wells going the whole way down. So I have monitoring wells on either side of this plume as well as in the middle of the plume. And we've traced the plume directory based on analytical data to Mar wells. Mar wells is also one of our sampling locations. By the time it's reaching Mar wells, it's less than the regulatory standard. So this plume right here is based on, once it gets past Mar wells, it's a USGS model, which was used for the Sagamore lens. It was for Mar wells. And the maximum extent of the plume is modeled over this way based on what the highest concentrations of the plume would be. So this is a worst case maximum extent the plume would be.
So you're saying that the airport is not having a regulatory impact on the narwhals and never has had?
Correct.
I'm just going to hand the microphone because I'm having a hard time hearing everyone.
Sam Wilson, I'm the chair of the, I guess now the Barnstable Municipal Water Board. I mean, we have to treat. We have to treat highest water company. We have to treat for
When I talk further in this presentation, you'll see that there's multiple PFAS sources in this area, with the Barnstable Fire Training Academy being the most significant. And the airport is contributing to that, but there's also other plumes that aren't even associated with the airport that exceed the regulatory threshold, all going down to Marwells. Mass DEP sum of 6. In our reports, we document the Mass DEP sum of 6, which is the regulatory value. That's 20 nanograms per liter. We also document total PFAS, which is the sum of all analytes detected, and then 6,2-fluorotelmer, which is the way that we can trace the airport's plume. It's something that makes it different than the other plumes. Yes, we're testing for the full suite that's reportable by the labs.
Ryan, that length that you say the plume dissipates is 2,500 feet. About, you said? I don't know. But I just read the Martha's Vineyard Airport PFAS study, and that I would assume would have pretty similar uses as Gateway Airport. And they have PFAS plume that's over nearly 2 miles long. So I'm surprised that Gateway Airport is only 2,500 feet long, that is below regulatory.
By the time it reaches the Marwells, it is below regulatory limits. We're able to trace it because of the forensic signature. I'll get into more detail later on the amount of times that the airport has used foam. It wasn't very consistent. When you look at the Fire Training Academy and the concentrations that they have, they're over 100 times higher than the airports. And I'm not familiar with what's going on at the Martha's Vineyard Airport, but I'm not surprised that there would be a plume that big. The plume from the Barnstable Fire Training Academy appears to be very large. The magenta one. Based on source usage. So the airport, and again, I'll get to this in a few slides, the airport only sprayed foam during emergencies, which there was 2 of them. They also sprayed foam annually, and again, I'll get to this a little bit later, but the amount of foam usage wasn't as high as these other places.
Sorry, I can contradict you a little bit. We've actually seen spray washouts from heavy spills from the 402s. You want to go back even farther, in New England, where the Gateway hangar is now, you get a lot of washdowns, the foam is probably contaminated. It's just draining it off, wash it down with eliminate fire.
The airports has collected hundreds of soil and groundwater samples from throughout the airport, and we've determined that these 2 locations, right here and right here, are the source areas.
Have you done the forensics of that cyan plume from the west, and then whose plume is that?
It's consistent with the Barnstable Fire Training Academy.
Have they owned up to that?
Their investigation is ongoing.
You know, it might be helpful. I don't think we understand the nature and extent of your study relative to butters. For example, the town of Yarmouth borders, now that I understand where this guy is, Mill Creek flows into Lewis Bay. There are over 10 million oysters in Lewis Bay. We have no idea whether or not there's this problem that's flowing down Mill Creek into the bay.
I'll-
And I don't know what your responsibility is, where it starts and stops.
So,
Might help with all these questions.
so I'll actually talk about Mill Creek because there was a study done by Harvard, And I'll get into the forensics on that as well. And Mill Creek does have PFAS, and again, that plume's consistent with the Fire Training Academy.
Brian, if I could jump in real quick. Sure. I know that we have a lot of questions. I wonder if the best course of action would be to let Brian go through a couple of these slides, and then we'll kind of stop, take a breath, see if you have any questions after we go through the first few slides, and then regroup and start the presentation over again. I think that might be best because some of the slides he has may answer some of the questions that you have this evening. But I've asked Brian to basically identify, of the 639 acres that are within airport property, and the map shows the property line. It's that black, thick line on the property map. Of that 639 acres, 2.25 acres were identified after a number of soil and water samples. 2.25 acres were identified as being having levels that were high in PFAS. Those two areas were the areas where the airport had tested on an annual basis firefighting foam. We're required to do that by the FAA. Brian will go through a slide that identifies how we're doing it today. We ceased that back in mid-2015, 2016 timeframe. And also every 3 years we did a multi-casual incident drill with local fire departments as well as representatives from the town of Barnstable, and we always sprayed foam. The idea of that was spray and use the equipment that you normally would if you were responding to an aircraft incident. Now with firefighting foam being recognized as having PFAS in it, we no longer spray that foam. We spray just water during our drills. But Brian's going to go through that with you tonight to kind of say, here's where we started when DEP notified us that we need to check into our practices using firefighting foam. Investigations of where that foam may have occurred within the airport versus regular background levels that we're finding all over the place outside of airport property boundaries, and what we're doing, the steps we have taken to make sure that we are responsible in cleaning up our site at the airport, knowing that there's other industrial sites north of the airport where PFAS contaminated water or soils are coming onto airport property, but we were able to fingerprint our PFAS, which Brian's going to go through in a few moments. So let's start there, and then we'll stop and take a breath. Sorry.
All right, so I'm just going to skip back to where we were. So I think this was the last slide that we were talking about. So the airport is testing for all PFAS analytes that can be reported by the laboratory. It's about a list of 40. Of those 40, Mass DEP is only regulating 6. And in the environmental consulting field, we call it the Mass DEP sum of 6. And it's just the sum of those 6 PFAS analytes summed together. And if it's over 20 nanograms per liter, you're exceeding the regulatory threshold. If it's under 20 nanograms per liter, it's not exceeding the regulatory threshold. So sources of PFAS, this is one of the things that makes a PFAS investigation extremely difficult. It's also one of the reasons why, when I talk later, we'll talk about a PFAS background study that we did in the area, that there's PFAS almost everywhere in this area. There's PFAS in the soil that's not related to airport operations off airport property. It's in the groundwater. It's kind of all over the place, and it's based on the ubiquitous nature of it and that it's in all of our products. So you can see it's in carpets, it's in cleaning products, food packaging, furniture. The list goes on and on. This is in all sorts of consumer products. It's also in AFFF. So AFFF was used at the airport to respond to fires, like Katie was saying. It's required by the FAA, and there's no other options available at this time that are PFAS-free. Even PFAS-free foam contains PFAS. So historically, AFFF was used triannually from 1991 to 2012. Those are the MCI incidents that Katie was talking about. Also, FAA requires annually that the airport test its firefighting apparatus to verify that it works. That testing was done between 2004 and 2015. And then there was also 2 airport emergencies where it was used for aircraft accidents in 1981 and 2016. Where these exercises took place was primarily in the deployment area. We also know that the airport consistently purchased the same type of foam. So again, this was extremely helpful when we did our forensics analysis, that we knew the chemical signature of the airport's plume, and it was extremely consistent and significantly different from other areas. So to date, the airport's collected over 131 soil samples, 210 groundwater samples, and 3 surface water samples from Uppergate and Lewis Pond. We used the forensics analysis to determine the airport source, to trace the Barnstable Fire Training Academy source as it passed through the airport, and also to identify other sources that are coming onto airport property that are not related to the airport's historic use of AFFF. We used the USGS model to determine the maximum extent of that plume. So that was what you saw in the previous slide, the 2 yellow areas. That plume is based on a combination of analytical data and hydrology modeling that was used. This is the map again, so I'll just point out quickly again. We've got Barnstable Fire Training Academy. We've kind of traced their plume going down this way. Again, how far it goes, we're not sure, but it's beyond the scope of the work that we're doing. We're just determining the nature and extent of the plume of PFAS related to the airport's historic use of AFFF, not others. But during the course of our investigation, we did identify multiple non-airport related PFAS sources. So since 2015, the airport hasn't used AFFF for training purposes. The airport was the first in the state to purchase an ecological card. I'll show you that picture in a minute. That's a unit that the airport purchased so that they could verify that their firefighting apparatus works without actually spraying foam. In 2016, that was the last time that AFFF was used at the airport. That was in response to an aircraft accident that happened right up front. This release was closed under a separate RTN with Mass DEP. The release was to the asphalt pavement and captured in a catch basin. The area was cleaned up and closed out. This is the ecological cart that Katie talked about. This was, again, purchased first airport in the state, and the reason that they purchased this is so that they could verify their firefighting apparatus worked without spraying foam. So the investigation began in 2016. And again, between 2016 and now, the airport's collected multiple samples to delineate the nature and extent of the airport's plume. So when I get into a little bit later, I'll talk about the environmental forensics. And the way that we do this is we know where the airport sprayed foam. We have a unique chemical signature of the analytes. We have to look beyond the 6 that are regulated by Mass DEP. If you only look at the 6, you can't do environmental forensics on this. So that's another reason why the airport is doing this larger list, so that we can see and track the plume based on its chemistry, not just it's the airport. So I'm going to kind of go through the steps in the regulatory that happened. So in 2016, Mass DEP issued a request for information for the airport based on their AFFF usage. They also asked for immediate response action plan to investigate PFAS and 1,4-dioxane. Now, this meeting's not going to talk about the 1,4-dioxane. The investigation identified, again, that 1,4-dioxane plume was actually coming from the industrial park area that's hydraulically upgrading to the airport, and it was just passing through the airport. That's been documented in multiple reports submitted to Mass DEP. So again, not the focus of this investigation, but it's another plume that we identified coming through the airport from a hydraulically upgradient source that's going to Mar Wells. In 2017, they submitted their first 2 IRA reports. An IRA report is an immediate response action status report. So every 6 months, the airport would submit a report to Mass DEP telling them what we've done and what we plan on doing to determine the nature and extent of the impacts. And again, this was a very big undertaking. We started to find out early on when we collected these samples that everywhere that we tested, there was PFAS.
And a lot of this information is also available on that PFAS, on our website, the PFAS page that we have. So the history that Brian's giving you, the background, all of that is there, plus all of the reports that have been submitted, in case you had further reading or wanted to learn more information.
So again, in 2017, they submitted their 2 IRA status reports every 6 months. We continued our investigation, collecting soil and groundwater samples and installing additional monitoring wells to delineate the nature and extent of the plume. We also submitted what's called the Phase 1 Initial Site Investigation Report and Tier Classification Report. It's the first milestone report in a Mass DEP regulatory submittal. 2018, we had 2 more IRA status reports. 2019, 2 more IRA status reports, and this is also when the airport became a public involvement site. So a group of residents petitioned Mass DEP and the airport to get the public more involved. So we started that process in 2019. We started it with a meeting similar to this, where we kind of talked about PFAS. We were still in the very early stages of our investigation back then. We were just starting to do the forensics aspect of it, and we were trying to figure out exactly what was kind of going on. And one thing I should note, the public involvement process allows the public who are on this list to comment on our phased reports. So IRA status reports aren't covered in that because that's just a status report. It's not a milestone report. But anytime a phased report comes in, like a comprehensive site assessment or these other phased reports, the people on the public list get notified that they have a 30-day public comment period. In 2020, we continued submitting our IRA status reports. We also submitted our draft phase 2. At this point, reports are going in draft mode because they're going out to the public and to Mass DEP for comment so that we can incorporate any of the public's comments back into the report. And then 2021, we did the IRA status report and the final phase 2. In 2022, we did 2 more IRA status reports. We did a revised phase 2 report to clarify our environmental forensics based on some questions from Mass DEP. So that revised phase 2 report really gets into the environmental forensics that we use to distinguish the extent of these plumes. We also submitted our draft and final phase 3 reports and our draft phase 4 report. And 2023, we've got our first IRA report and our final phase 4 report. In the next month and a half, we'll be putting out our last report for public comment for probably the next 5 or 6 years. We're in remedial operating status. And just to give you a quick depiction of where we are, this is kind of the MCP timeline for when a site comes in. And this last step right here is either permanent or temporary solution, remedial operating status, or tier classification. So this is kind of the last step when you're in. You've already done your remediation. Now you're just doing some sort of monitoring or looking to get to regulatory closure. So the airport has now progressed all the way through the steps. It's just about enter remedial operation status, where we'll continue to do groundwater monitoring as we watch the concentrations drop as they went towards Marwells. So this last year, we did quarterly monitoring at Marwells, and we saw the airport's plume hit Marwell based on their forensic signature, which is a 6,2 fluorotomer. And we saw that concentration slightly creep up and then start to drop back down. And that's the effect of the soil caps that were installed at the airport in 2020, because the airport basically cut off the plume by capping the source. So they capped the 2 PFAS source areas that I showed in yellow, like up at the very top in the deployment area. They capped those so that there's no continued leaching. Initially, there was no plan to remove the source of contamination for a couple reasons. Removing the contamination has its own issues. We'd be sending it somewhere else versus where it is now, it's controlled. We monitor this area for every 6 months to verify that the caps are working. It's also very difficult to get rid of PFAS. The technology for it is still kind of moving. But right now, this method was chosen as the best alternative to not send the contamination somewhere else to make it somebody else's problem, but to manage it on site where we can keep it capped, we can keep it controlled, and then reevaluate in the future if there's something that needs to happen. But where it is now, it's in a controlled environment and it's not leaching.
One would argue if they're drinking that water, they would prefer to be stored in the warehouse somewhere else.
It's not leaching into the groundwater. So the way that the cap works, and you'll see this in future slides, is that it redirects the water around it so that it doesn't come in contact with the contaminated soil. And through this flushing action that happens, the concentrations continue to drop, and they have been continuing to drop.
Have there been soil samples taken?
Soil samples were taken initially to delineate the extent of the cap, and then the soil is covered, so you can't sample it anymore. It's completely capped. But we have monitoring wells inside the cap and hydraulically down gradient of the cap. So we monitor the groundwater, show if the cap is working, and we do that every 6 months. And you'll see later on in the slides how the effect that the caps had.
Brian, before you get off this screen, can you just briefly, very briefly, talk about what the MCP is? Just, I don't think everybody knows what that is. Talk about what it is and why we're following this course of action.
So the MCP is the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, and it's the regulations that licensed site professionals follow to get sites into compliance. So it dictates how we do our investigations, how things are done, and there's different phases throughout that process. So there's 5 phases, and then there's permanent solution. So that's kind of what this table shows right here. So ideally, within 5 to 6 years, a site's closed out. And there's certain things that make that timeline increase because some sites are very complex and there's more portions to it. But the MCP dictates these various phases 1 through 5. So phase 1 is the initial site investigation. That's kind of documenting I have an issue. There's some limited groundwater sampling, and here's what we have. Phase 2 is comprehensive site assessment, which is we've delineated the full nature and extent of the plume impacts. We know where it is. We know where it's going. Now we're going to plan for remediation. Phases 3 and 4, phase 3 is here's what I'm proposing to do for remediation. Phases 4 is implementing that remediation, doing the construction, installing a system if need be. And then phase 5 is monitoring the remediation status. So right now the airport's entering phase 5. We have our caps in place. They're working. We've been monitoring it since 2020, and we've seen a substantial drop in PFAS concentration in the groundwater downgrading of these caps.
Yeah, a couple questions. You mentioned that 20 nanograms per liter. Isn't that a moving target? Isn't that getting lesser under EPA?
It is. So PFAS is an emerging contaminant. We don't know a whole lot about it. They're still doing risk assessment, toxicology investigations, but for now, our regulation is stricter than what EPA has proposed. EPA is 70 nanograms per liter for 2 analytes. Mass DEP is doing 20 for 6. If it will change in the future, I'm not sure. I'm not a toxicologist, but
If it does change, do you then have to reevaluate your effort here?
if it did change, then we would reevaluate, but our source is controlled. So we already know that our plume size is mitigating and dropping. And based on the current standard, we're not exceeding, by the time it gets to the receptor, the drinking water wells, that the concentration of PFAS has dropped below the regulatory limit. It's not to say that the airport's plume isn't impacting Mar wells. It is, and it's part of our remediation. And the town is treating Mar wells for PFAS and providing safe drinking water.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, just your point there. Is the activity of the Mar well part of your solution?
Yes.
If that well wasn't pumping, what would happen?
We would have to do something else. So the risk is the Mar wells is the receptor. So Mar wells is what the risk is. And our plume, by the time it gets to Mar wells, isn't at that regulatory standard. But let's say there was drinking water wells in place, then we would have to do some other type of method. But Mar wells right now is acting as a treatment source because the plant was developed to treat for PFAS.
Could you explain remediation, what that clean up prevention, and does it include remuneration? For example, if it's foreseeable that this contaminant could spread to Yarmouth, to Milpon, Creek, is there payment to the bordering town or mistake made because of this particular chemical agent? Part of your remediation?
No, that's not what this would do. So the MCP is just delineating the nature and extent of the impact and then following the regulation to achieve regulatory closure and to address risk. So the airport has delineated their plume. We've identified it. We know how far it's going. We know that by the time it goes into Yarmouth, it's not over any regulatory standard. So that's where we're following in the MCP, that the plume, as it leaves the airport's property, exceeds the drinking water standard, and as it moves away from the airport, it dilutes and disperses, and the concentration continues to drop and to drop and to drop. And the reason that it drops is because we've capped the source. So by capping the soil contamination, the impacts aren't leaching into groundwater anymore, and the plume basically detaches and starts to shrink in size and drop in concentration, which is what's been happening.
Is that a theory or is that an actual occurrence?
That's an actual occurrence. So I'll get to it in a few more slides, where we've been monitoring it for the last couple of years.
Brian, underneath the cap, when you first started this, I believe your total PFAS concentrations were 15,000 nanograms per liter. What is it now?
We were 1,500 nanograms per liter. We were 1.5 micrograms per liter. Oh, no, you're correct. It was 15. We're down to less than 1. And yes. Yes. But that is total PFAS, not regulated PFAS, and it's also a drop in the bucket compared to other concentrations. No, it's different. The MCP has its own things that it follows. So EPA is 70 nanograms per liter. Mass DEP is going more stringent than that. Yes, so Mass DEP has their 20 nanogram per liter, but it's only for the 6. But the airport is reporting all analytes in the events that the regulations do change in the future, and there's more risk assessment numbers. So what Tom's pointing out is, although that number sounds very high, it's related to one specific analyte, which isn't even a regulated analyte. And it's not a regulated analyte because it's something that DEP has determined isn't one of major concern at this time. May change in the future, but at this time, there's not enough support for it to be considered a significant risk. We're being conservative and reporting total PFAS so that we know that this is what the total sum is in the event that the regulations change in the future. Yes, so 90% of the one analyte that's driving that is 6,2-fluorotelmer, and that's not a regulated analyte. Of that remaining concentration, only 10% of it is the sum of 6, and some of those sum of 6 aren't even related to the airport. They're related to the plume that's coming through the airport.
One more thing on the Maher wells. Have you done a risk analysis? What if that well, for whatever reason, stopped functioning? What time period would be critical? Because it is part of your analysis, the pumping of that well. Have you studied that?
So all... It wouldn't affect this because the only reason that the treatment needs to occur at Mar Wells is because the risk is associated with the drinking aspect of that well. So if that well wasn't shut off, if that well wasn't providing drinking water, there's no risk because people aren't drinking the water.
No, but would the PFAS then flow more if it's not being pumped up?
It would change the direction slightly. So you can see, I don't have that figure pulled up, but our plume is getting kind of pulled into the corner because of the pumping at Mar Wells. If that well wasn't pumping, the trajectory may change slightly.
Was there ever an alternative well to be used for the public drinking water supply?
I'm not sure.
So people were drinking that prior to the knowledge of PFAS.
What I can tell you is that the airport's plume didn't get to Mar Wells till 2020, and treatment was already in place. But there are other plumes that impacted that area that we just don't know, and I don't know what the time frame of it would have been. But we physically traced our plume, and it hadn't reached Mar Wells yet. And we knew based on our modeling when it was going to get there, and we continued to monitor Mar Wells. And then our fingerprint showed up in 2020, maybe last year.
So the other plume,
The cyan and the magenta plume had already...
from fire training activities.
The magenta plume that's from the Barnstable Fire Training Academy. This,
And forensically, you can distinguish between the foam used
yes,
at the airport versus what they use.
yes. It's because the airport used a fluoropolymer-based foam, and we have purchase records that go back 20 years, and they have an extremely distinct signature, which I'll get to. The Fire Training Academy plume has a totally different signature, so it's easy to look at and say, this is the airport, this is not.
Are they able to now like distinguish between firefighting foams and other sources like nonstick pans and like say landfills and other like rugs?
There is. So one of the other things that we did is we sent our samples for forensics analysis to Battelle, where they have a library of various sources that they can compare the materials to. They said that the impacts that were being seen down at Mara Wells 2 were consistent with firefighting foam. Not to say that there's other stuff that's not in there, but that's what it was.
Brian, you said that the airport's balloon got to the Mara Wells in 2022.
It got there last year, yes.
But we've seen this 6.2 fluoropolymer signature in the wells in 2020, and it was also picked up in Mill Creek in 2018.
Yes, and that's because 6.2 fluorotelm was also slightly used by the Fire Training Academy. And again, you'll see that in our slide. And we actually traced the impacts, because I'll have forensic signatures of Mill Creek. Mill Creek's signature matches Marwell 1 perfectly. And when I backtrace Marwell 1, it's coming from off airport property. I see it at Wendy's. I see it coming down. So it's basically that the plume got recirculated back around, or there's other sources. But again, I'll show the fingerprints shortly. I don't understand. The Barnstable Fire Training Academy? Right.
Right, those are our two plumes that are identified. So,
But again, it's a totally different forensic signature. So just because this 6.2 fluorotelm detected doesn't mean that it's related to the airport. So the airport has a very distinct signature. And again, when I get to those slides, I'll kind of talk through it. But six.
Travel more than 2,000 feet, but the fire train traveled more than 10,000.
Yes. I think it has to do with the ongoing usage and the depth to groundwater, the amount of time that it was used at some of these locations. Again, the airport wasn't a chronic source. We've traced their plume. We see that signature, the signature that you're talking about at Mill Creek, coming on to the airport from somewhere else. It's at a considerably deep depth, meaning it's coming from somewhere far away and couldn't be linked back to the airport. So I see the signature that you see down at Marwell 1 and that you see in Mill Creek is 80 feet below grade. The proximity to the ARF building, it couldn't happen. It's also hydraulically cross gradient to it. It's two different plumes. It's meaning that it came from somewhere far away and that it's been traveling and dropping as it goes, and that's why we're seeing it at that depth. And then it's getting pulled up by Marwells. I don't have the cross section here. There's plumes stacked on top of each other, and then there's intermixed plumes. So the airport's plume is sitting above a much larger plume. All right, so here's just some statistic numbers. So during our site investigation, we mapped the nature and extent of PFAS in soil, mapped the PFAS in groundwater, and here's kind of the statistic aspect. The highest detection at the airport, this is on airport property in the deployment area, is 65 times higher than the GW1 standard. This is at the source. It's 700 times less than the Method 1 GW3 standard, which is protective of surface water. And it can be identified based on the forensic signatures clearly. So the regulatory limit for drinking water is 20 nanograms per liter, 0.02 micrograms per liter. The highest concentration detected at the airport is 1.29. The Barnstable Fire Training Academy is 205. So this is kind of telling you the order of magnitude in release concentrations. It's 100 times higher, more than 100 times higher. In the industrial park area, we've got PFAS coming in. Again, there's no hydraulic connection to the airport. This is hydraulically up gradient. We have PFAS coming in at twice the regulatory standard. at the Rotary near Wendy's. This is hydraulically cross-gradient to the airport at a well that's 80 feet deep. We have concentration of 0.0987, which is very close to the concentration at Marwell 1, and it's also got a very similar signature to the Fire Training Academy. So again, here's our plume map. There's also drinking water wells up here, so you can see the proximity of the Fire Training Academy plume to these drinking water wells here, as well as it hitting Mary Dunn Pond and then going down this way. And then also another plume coming on this way. So the rotary is somewhere over here. There's no hydraulic connection. And at 80 to 90 feet below grade, you see the PFAS signature that's very consistent with the Fire Training Academy, and that's also at Marwell 1, and similar to what was down at Mill Creek, not similar at all to the airport. These are the two areas where there was impacts related to the historic AFFF usage at the airport. So the first area right here is the Airport Rescue and Firefighting Building. This is where the firefighter apparatus is stored. This is where foam concentrate is stored. This is where the fire trucks are stored. The second area is over here. This is the deployment area. This is the area where they actually sprayed foam and did their testing. And then you can see all of these soil borings that we put around it. This is how we delineated the extent of PFAS impacts in soil. They're based on exceedances, so everything inside this yellow box exceeds Mass DEP regulatory standards. The highest concentrations of PFAS were right here. This is where the foam was actually sprayed. These are the areas that were capped, right here and right here. And there's monitoring wells in the cap as well as throughout the cap. The cap is a plastic geomembrane that's fusion welded on site that's specifically made for PFAS. So one of the things that the airport was concerned with is installing a plastic product that contained PFAS, because PFAS is in everything. So we tested this product, verified that it did indeed was PFAS free. It's a thick plastic, 30 mil, with a seam welded, and it basically acts as just to think of it as a tarp, like a very thick tarp that prevents groundwater from infiltrating into the contaminated soil. So when you cap this material, rainwater isn't infiltrating through the soil anymore, and that's what was causing the groundwater impacts below.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question, because recently the town council gave money, and I know Dan is here, maybe he can speak to it, to do some forensics testing on the Marlboro wells. With all the testing you've described, and all the testing the county, what was that additional test? What is the point of that? Has that been completed?
So I'm actually going to discuss the forensic testing at Mar Wells. That's in future slides. I just haven't got there yet.
The target material, what's the service life, expected service life?
200 years. Yes.
That's the actual East Rim. People don't realize that that's the East Rim. North side of the East Rim, where you've done your testing. Have you done anything east of that on the other side of Yarmouth Road?
Off airport property?
Off the airport property?
We wouldn't be delineating the nature extent of a PFAS soil release off airport property unless we were chasing our impacts.
Not too far from there, over there, there is a Yarmouth water well. There is a well there. I think there's also a test well, too.
Sorry. We know our groundwater impacts are going this way, though. They're not going up this way. So we know that all of our impacts from this area are going down to Mar Wells, and we've delineated the extent of soil impacts through vigorous testing over here. We've also tested soil along the entire runway stretch.
Brian, if you can go back to the map previously that shows the larger image, can you just explain the way that groundwater moves and why we are testing in particular areas?
Sure. So you can see, it's kind of hard to see. There's these blue lines right here, and this represents groundwater flow direction. So it kind of goes a couple ways. First, groundwater is following this direction, and it's going right down to Mar Wells too. So it's doing this. From up here, it's also going down this way and going down to here. It's not going this way. That would be uphill. So we're tracing our plume by, we have monitoring wells that are what we call hydraulically cross gradient to show the edge of this plume. So I have monitoring wells out in the road over here. I got monitoring wells over here, up here, down here in the middle. And I can delineate the plume by monitoring wells that are on the outside because groundwater is flowing in this direction and in this direction.
I neglected when I first got up to thank the officials, the town council is here tonight. Betty Luke, Mr. Lloyd Starr, is that anybody else from the, oh, Mr. Derry? Thank you for coming, Mike, super council. And Mr. Santos, I've never met him before, it's great, over here. Nice to see the big guns out tonight, thank you. The town administrator?
Thank you, Bob.
Do you have a slide on your treatments of this later, Brian?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yep.
I'll save my question for later.
Almost getting there. I'll spend a good amount of time on that. So what I'm going to talk about next is this is just kind of the background, what we've done, and then I'll talk about what we did to remediate the issue and what we're going to do in the future. So there's pictures of the caps and what they look like and how we installed them. There's some photographs in there. So we'll kind of go through that so you can see how we capped the area, what it looks like, and the monitoring that we do. And then I also have depictions of the radar plots and kind of what each source looks like. And then I'll also talk about the impacts in the Harvard study at Mill Creek.
Thank you. You cap you have to cap everything. One thing that's confusing me a little bit is you're doing a good job of delineating what the airport was closeted and what we came off. However, we have to treat everything that's on that property. Is that the correct assumption?
You mean on airport property?
Yes.
No. So the airport's required to treat for what it is impacted, which is what we've done. So the airport capped its source areas. Their plume is going towards Marwells, and they're treating that. But the airport wouldn't be required to treat PFAS sources that aren't related to the airport. They would have, if the airport wasn't a PFAS site and there was a PFAS plume that was traveling through it and the airport never used PFAS, they would go for downgradient property status in Massachusetts, meaning their property has been impacted by a release, but it's not the source of the release. So the airport itself is being impacted by PFAS from other people. So what you're seeing here, these plumes have nothing to do with the airport other than there's been a release somewhere up here, and that release is sending PFAS impacted groundwater through the airport down to the Marwells. Then there's the Fire Training Academy, which is also doing the same thing. And then you have the airport's plume as well. So it's very complicated, and there's a lot going on, but the airport wouldn't be treating what's going on up here. They wouldn't be responsible for that.
I'm kind of shocked at that, to tell you the truth. That those are the rules in general according to Mass DEP standards.
So what Mass DEP would do, Mass DEP has all of this information. So what Mass DEP tends to do is they'll look and see who operates up in this area and send them a request for information to try to identify these people, because they should be doing their own investigation and delineating the nature and extent. The Fire Training Academy is starting to do their phase 2, so they haven't even delineated the full nature and extent of their plume. They're still kind of in phase 1. We've already gone way past that. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done for their plume. We just happen to identify these during the course of our investigation.
It's town property. I'm shocked that we don't have to take care of that. That's news to me. Thank you.
So the plumes are defined based on the hydrology of the site, and then also based on chemical signatures. So every single groundwater sample that we've tested, we've done forensics analysis on to see, is it consistent with the airport? So impacts up in this area right here would have no connection to the airport because groundwater goes this way. It doesn't go uphill. Yes, so when we put our monitoring wells in, we put them in for various reasons. So I put monitoring wells up in the industrial park because I was seeing inconsistent detections of PFAS all over the place. And I wanted to see, well, is all of this related to the airport or is it coming onto airport property? So we stepped outside of the airport and did work in the town right-of-ways and installed clustered monitoring wells and identified these huge plumes that are extremely deep. They start shallow and they go down to 100 plus feet. Again, these are plumes that are from far away and that have, made their way down. There could be one source or 20 sources, but they're chemically different than it's we've it's all sand. So the airport's plume goes maybe 30 to 40 feet into groundwater, and it's getting pulled in by Mar wells. But there's impacts 100 feet deep that are even before the airport, meaning that there's a big PFAS issue in this area. Mar wells are only picking up a portion of it. So the Mar wells have a certain screen interval. And again, we didn't determine how deep the PFAS impacts go. We only determined for the purposes of the airport's plume to see where it was. So we have multiple stacked wells that are screened in different intervals throughout the plume to see, this is the airport's plume, and then underneath that is another plume. But all of these plumes are all stacked on top of each other. So we stopped. We went, about 100, 120 feet deep and could clearly say, here's the airport's plume, here's fire training, here's others, and then we stopped. We didn't continue to drill to see how deep it goes. So it could go deeper, or maybe it stops where we stopped drilling. But we only drilled these wells to delineate the extent of the airport's plume.
So the Mar wells are taking water from up to what depth?
I think 80 to 90 feet, Dan. Sound about right? Yeah, they've got.
So water that's contaminated, that's not necessarily the airport, is passing by the plume, by the wells,
Yes.
and is heading out to toward Lewis Bay.
Yes.
And have we tested in that area, or we don't test when it's not drinking water?
Nope, it was tested by Harvard, and it was tested in 2018, and I'll get to that. And again, the forensics on that match exactly what's detected in Marwell 1 and also is consistent with what's coming onto airport property in the Fire Training Academy. And again, those tests were before the airport's plume was even down there. So the airport plume hit Marwell 2 in 2022, and we were tracing it years before that. So I knew that in 2020, it was in like the middle of the road about here. And I had monitoring wells here, and I knew that it wasn't there yet, but it was moving towards it, and I know groundwater is moving about 300 feet per year, so I predicted that in 2022, that's when we would see it. And then we started to see it in 2022, and we monitored it every quarter, and you could literally see the year that it wasn't there, where the signature is very consistent with what you've been seeing in Mill Creek and the others, and then all of a sudden it changes when the airport's plume gets there, and you all of a sudden see this big spike in 6,2 fluorotomer that's different than what was there before. And then you see that continue in the second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, the concentration starts to drop because our source has been managed. So we've stopped and capped this source a couple years ago. So we've modeled that in about another 6 years, the plume will have dissipated and all of the regulatory exceedances that were there would be gone. So our model predicts, down here, by the time it's getting, to Marwells and to Mill Creek and to that area, it's less than the drinking water standard. But that's only accounting for the airport source. I'm not accounting for all of the other PFAS issues. So there's other PFAS sources that are in there and that are causing an issue. But if you look at the airport's plume separately as its own release based on the highest concentrations that we've detected, kind of a worst case scenario number, that's what this is.
Can I ask you, it just seems when you laid out your numbers, you just talked about the fire training academy, you seem to move at a fairly rapid pace, so to speak, when you did all these phases.
Yeah.
And you said that the fire training academy is still in phase 1.
Correct.
These plumes are already in Lewis Bay. Is there no requirement to move at a pace?
There is a requirement to move at a pace, and hopefully that will be managed. But the MCP is supposed to be going back to,
Why did you move at the pace?
because we were following the regulations.
Hi, can I want now? Can you hear me? Yes? Without it? You can hear me anyway. So I want to address that, what you're saying about the fire training area for the county's former area. They have to follow the same rules, and the town of Barnstable has been very concerned about the pace of their efforts. And we have worked closely with the Department of Environmental Protection as recently as the last several weeks, meeting with them because the DEP is putting together a consent order to require the county to work at a certain pace and to meet milestones which they have heretofore not met. So the DEP is concerned with their pace of cleanup. And so we've made that clear to DEP. We've had meetings, and so they are now working with us. They've actually called a technical meeting in the next month where they want to understand exactly what the Fire Training Academy is doing, what their intent is, because what Brian is basically pointing out is that much of the impacts of the Fire Training Academy go well beyond the area of our drinking water wells and well into Yarmouth. But they don't know where, and they should know where, honestly. This has been 8 years that they've been working on this. So,
Yeah, that's my point. It's absurd. It seems absolutely absurd.
So,
Not further along.
well, we believe that too, and we're concerned about responsibility, and that's why you mentioned that there was an appropriation request from Public Works to do some forensic testing. That's exactly what we're doing, is we want to understand and connect what we're seeing in our wells to a source. And we believe that source to be the Fire Training Academy. And we want to have the hard data to be able to go to the county and the DEP and say, look, this is their problem too, and they need to address it, or someone needs to address it, but it's not being done, and it's not being done quickly. So we're working.
And Sam probably knows, the PFAS is in the straightaway wells.
Right.
Right, so why are we testing that? It just seems like it's already in Nantucket Sound.
We are,
I
right?
mean,
You're right. We
Why
are.
are we going to do straightway, or do we have the forensics on
Well,
straightway?
yes. Right now, we're treating. Straightway is one of our drinking water wells, so we're treating all of our drinking water wells
Correct.
for PFAS, and they are treating that PFAS to non-detectable levels. So PFAS is not in our drinking water wells. However, we're having to pay a lot of money to do that treatment and to build these treatment plants. We've spent almost $30 million so far on a problem we didn't create. So we want to understand who's responsible so we can go after those parties and get reimbursement for our ratepayers. We did this for the Mary Dunn wells, you may recall. The Mary Dunn wells are right down gradient or very close to the Fire Training Academy, and it's clear that they were contaminated and impacted by PFAS from that site. The county ultimately, after threat of lawsuit, agreed to settle, and they made capital payments, and they make ongoing operating cost payments to the town, and will into the future while we have to operate that. We want the same deal for the responsible parties for all of our other wells. We believe that, so if you think about this, and I don't have pictures to show you, but if the Mary Dunn wells, which are near the Fire Training Academy, are drawing PFAS in and sending that water throughout the water system, many of those homes, businesses, have septic systems. That water is going into the ground at each of those septic systems. And then from there, or our wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so that's where it's going. So you got to follow that path. And much of Hyannis is sewered, so much of that water is going to the wastewater treatment plant. And then it's being distributed as because we distribute the treated wastewater into the ground. And so that goes down, and as you said, straightway well. So our suspicion, and this is why we want to do this forensic work, is that that Fire Training Academy signature contamination went from the Mary Dunn wells through our treatment plant down into other well sources, which we're now treating. But if that's the case, we want to go back and try to have an agreement with the county to have some of those funds replaced, or figure out how to unburden the Hyannis water system ratepayers from this really tremendous cost. Now, this is not just happening here. This is happening nationwide, and so a lot of money has been made available, hopefully, to remediate and to rectify the situation. We're going to work hard with the county. We'll work with them. We don't want to fight them, but we're trying to push them through DEP to provide funds for not only future remediation, but we were way out ahead of this. We started treating in 2015, so we don't want all that money we spent to date just to not be considered. We want to get it paid back. So that's what the Fire Training Academy issue is at this point in time.
Yes.
What consideration, given that you're saying there's this huge plume that's coming out of an industrial area within the town of Barnstable, what consideration then impact the cost and everything else to the town of Yarmouth, given that you now have it flowing down into us? What kinds of monetary considerations or other kinds of efforts are going to be made, given there appears to be responsibility that is coming out of sites and you're on your town property besides just the airport?
So that would be outside the scope of the Massachusetts contingency plan, and definitely beyond what my specialty is. So for this type of work, we do it following the regulations. We delineate the nature and extent of the impacts. We remediate those impacts, and then that's what the course of the MCP is. It's not about civil liability or other things associated with it.
No, actually, it's more of a question for Mr. Sandos because of the fact of the work that you're doing at this time on behalf of the town of Barnstable.
So you want to address what, if there are financial impacts to the town of Yarmouth, how that's being addressed? Well, this is, I can't address that. That's the public works director. This becomes a civil issue. We're dealing with the environmental aspect, and so as we have pursued the county, Yarmouth would have to pursue the county, Barnstable would have to figure out who's responsible and whether there are impacts, whether there are monetary impacts, and how that might be addressed. But I have no idea how that would go, and it's not being dealt with currently, other than our work with the county.
Yeah, because I mean, your discussion about the plume coming from other sources besides just the airport does leave that quite open in terms of what we're building. Thank you.
Could you go back to the slide that has the image of the plume on it? My question relates to homeowners southeast of that. The news you give us is hopeful that in the coming years it will be diluted to feasible levels for drinking water. But for private homeowners that have well water and not town water, what are the Mass DEP requirements on that if it's touching their properties and it's affecting them?
So we reviewed all that. So one of the things that we did is when we did our delineation here, we looked at every single property that fell within that plume, and we sent them all letters, and we notified them that they were within a plume. We also looked at the Board of Health records and Mass DEP records to verify that everybody in this area was on town water and that they didn't have a risk. So the risk is mitigated because there's nobody drinking that water. If you did have a drinking water well, and let's say there wasn't town water provided to you, then there's means in the Massachusetts contingency plan to help that homeowner. You do point of treatment systems, at the house, provide bottled water, those type of things. So that stuff was initially evaluated back once we figured out where our plume was going. And
And did you look to the southeast? You went into Yarmouth and down towards McCreed?
yes, we did everything to here. So we know that based on our modeling, our plume stops right here. This is the maximum extent of the plume. So this is
At what point in time?
this is it. This is what's going to happen. So the plume hasn't made it down here. It's just entering to Marwell 2, so it's probably, about here. And what happens is the concentration just dissipates and dissipates and dissipates because of dilution. So what happens is the concentrations in this source area right here, it's capped. So there's no more leaching. So what made this plume this size is because the source continued to leach contaminated groundwater every time it rained, and it made the plume grow. So what happened is we stopped the leaching, so the plume now stops. It stops the further leaching, and it starts to almost cut itself off, and then it dilutes. So the plume concentration now has, water, groundwater that doesn't have those really high concentrations of PFAS in it. It has lesser concentrations, and it dilutes it. So this model is showing what the extent is of the GW1 impacts, and by the time it gets down here, it's 50% of the GW2 impact. So it's at a level that's half of what's regulated. Does it continue with lesser concentrations? Yes, but those are unregulated concentrations. So the maximum extent of the plume for what's modeled right to here is half of the drinking water standard. So it's 0.01 or 10 micrograms per liter.
Okay, sorry, I just need to interrupt for a second. I need everybody to use the microphone. It's working now. Everyone at home wants to hear your questions. So, thank you.
So just to follow on with that, if the drinking water standard is to change in the future, will that impact how we view this plume?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Next question. Can you just show inside of that yellow outline where the wells are, the Mar wells?
Yeah, so I get a future graphic that shows a 3D image of the plume, and that you'll see where the Mar wells are in relation to the plume and where the concentrations are. So this is kind of just a two-dimensional depiction. So I've got an image coming later that actually shows how the plume concentrations vary, because the plume concentrations are different throughout the extent of the plume. So the higher concentrations are up here, and it continues to drop as it spreads out. So you'll see that in a future image.
Do you envision in the future, and hopefully in the near future, that there'll be more of a corroboration or regional solution to this? Because right now what you've described is really unworkable in terms of the airport property at this point. And there are going to be multiple ownership of all of these plumes that seem to be coming through your airport and mixing with yours. Mm-hmm. And would you also explain to me, since the 6,2 fluorotelmer has shown up in Mill Creek, how that isn't your signature?
So it's not our signature because 6,2 fluorotelmer is also at the Fire Training Academy. So the airport used a fluorotelmer-based foam that's primarily fluorotelmer-based, 6,2 fluorotelmer. It's like 90% that. The Fire Training Academy used whatever they used. So they have a mix. So their signature also contains 6,2 fluorotelmer, but not at the relative concentration at the airport. So how you can track it is again, I'll show you when you get to the radar plots. The airport's signature is basically a straight line. You don't see anything else. So imagine a clock, and the airport's signature goes right to 12 o'clock. It's just a line that goes straight up.
Why don't we just go ahead to those slides?
Yeah.
And then we'll come back to the other slides, but let's just go to this signature.
All right. So here's Mill Creek. So that's the 6,2 fluorotelmer, that little spike right there. You see all this other stuff? This is also what's being detected in Marwell 1. These are very, very similar. You've got a large tail down here. You've got 6,2. You have some other things. You've got the Fire Training Academy. There's the 6,2. See how it has 6,2 there? It has the tail. It has this. This is the airport signature. It's 90% 6,2 fluorotelmer. So I don't have this slide. This isn't included in the slide, but before, when we were tracking the airport's plume, I had this signature, exact signature, maybe 400 feet away from Marwell's. It wasn't there yet. And we had this signature, which was before the airport's plume got there. I'm sorry, this Marwell 1, I'm sorry. But when Marwell 2 got impacted by the airport, you would see that all of a sudden you have this huge hit where you'd see it small right here. Basically everything else would drop and you'd see a giant hit up here. So I can say that Mill Creek is consistent with Marwell 1, also consistent with the Fire Training Academy, and it also matches to a T the groundwater monitoring wells that are over by Wendy's, which is cross-gradient to the airport, which kind of goes back to what Dan was saying, that this water has been circulated around town for a long time. Those impacts from the Fire Training Academy probably occurred, I don't know, at some point. and circled around. So the airport has purchase records for 20 years that show that this is the foam that they use. It's not a PFO or PFAS-based foam. It's a fluoropolymer-based foam, and we could trace that signature at the source of the airport. 500 feet away from the airport, 1,000 feet away from the airport. That signature was identical. And then we could see underneath it these other plumes. We could see, going up to the fire training academy, we traced their plume coming onto the airport property, and we were able to track it all the way down. So, what Dan was saying is that's kind of the presumption that we're going with, is that that's how the impact got spread. So this detection in Mill Creek was 2 years before the airport's plume even made it down to Marwell. It wasn't even anywhere near there yet. But Marwell 1 already had those impacts that were consistent with the fire training academy, and again, consistent with what's going down at Wendy's and what's coming onto the airport from other sources. We're seeing impacts of PFOA and PFAS coming onto airport property from other sources. So the airport has purchase records for 20 years that it's a fluoropolymer-based foam that has PFOA and PFAS as a contaminant from the telomerization process. But again, when you look at these concentrations, let me go back to...
I just thought under the deployment area, the shallow well had high concentrations of the...
Let's just define, I want to define high. So when you look at the maximum concentration detected at the airport, this is the highest it's ever been, 1.29. You look at the fire training academy.
Is 0.020.
Correct. This is
So it's
total.
high. So
This
it
is
is
total PFAS. But when you look at what the fire training academy is, it is orders of magnitude higher. It is a much more chronic source, which is why you have this massive extent. Just because 6,2 fluoropolymer was detected.
Thank you. Is it safe for any of us to drink the water? That's all I want to know.
Yes. So the town put in, by great expense, a drinking water system that provides drinking water that meets the Mass DEP regulatory limits. So it is providing safe drinking water to the town.
Yeah, yes, if you're on Hyannis water system water, we treat 100% of our water for PFAS at the well sites with basically giant versions of Brita filters, active carbon filtration. So, yeah, I'm proud to say I think we have the best drinking water on the Cape, actually.
Can I just add our perspective on it? I'm a resident of Hyannis Park in Yarmouth. And yes, we have wonderful water, just as you do in Barnstable. But there are consequences. We live on the banks of Mill Creek. It is the center of our recreational life. And right now, because of the levels of PFAS in Mill Creek, we can't swim in it. We can't consume fish or shellfish from it. And of course, Mill Creek is flowing into Lewis Bay, and it's unknown at this point how much contamination is in Lewis Bay. So there are consequences beyond drinking water, and certainly drinking water is the most important, but these are impacts that affect communities. And that's why solutions which concentrate on the forensics or the signatures is absolutely maddening to residents like myself, because we want it cleaned up, we want a plan that is comprehensive, and we're not willing to wait. We want things done now.
I think to address your comment, you are correct, and what Dan had said earlier is that there's a technical summit that's planned, because there's a lot going on here. This is very complicated. And the airport has put in great effort to identify that there's a much larger problem here than just the airport's plume. And we're meeting to discuss that. I think that there is more investigation that needs to happen. Other parties need to be identified and do their fair share. It shouldn't be the airport's burden to clean up, investigate all these other PFAS plumes that aren't related, other than to bring it to the attention of Mass DEP so that we can help get a discussion going, which is what we're doing.
On behalf of Yarmouth, just a couple of comments, and I do want to acknowledge that Laurie Rosala is here, who is the town's water and wastewater superintendent and a registered professional engineer. I'm not an engineer. However, I have, after meeting with some of the local residents and discussing these issues, I was in contact with the DEP as recently as this afternoon, and a couple of just comments that I want to make. First of all, I just want to say I'm not blaming, the airport for this sense of frustration, but all of us feel, especially, on the Yarmouth side, with so many of these plumes coming down that same direction, it is in no way comforting to know that the airport feels like their plume is not the biggest one. That is entirely unhelpful. And it's, so the issue is bigger for us now. I do want to say for local residents, please be aware, this entire PFAS issue is continuously emerging. And there are not real hard standards on all of the environmental impacts associated with these compounds. Now, the DEP has focused on the water quality, drinking water quality components to that. And I want to say, I can underscore the comments from the town of Barnstable with the treatment that they're doing. The water levels, the levels in the drinking water are fine. Now, the location of the Yarmouth wells in relation to all of the plumes, whether it's from the academy, whether it's from the airport, or the northerly industrial park, the groundwater flow is not directly at the town of Yarmouth water supply wells. So we don't anticipate that that's going to change direction and move in a different direction. However, it is a critical concern when you're dealing with the PFAS, number one, and that level of 20, that's for the water quality. And so we don't have in Yarmouth today a direct threat from these plumes in our water supply. And all of the residents in the area are on the public water supply. So what we're dealing with is an ecological harm. We talk about the levels in Mill Creek, and one of the issues that I discussed with the DEP, and they've agreed, and they're forwarding along an agreement to the town of Yarmouth, is we've asked them, and the Hyannis Park Civic Association, your leadership has been tremendous, and they're going to be coming down in the Mill Creek area and conducting some rigorous sampling to determine the specific levels in that area. Now, their preliminary analysis of the data that they've seen, the data in the Harvard study, they make very strong delineation between the levels that are allowable in drinking water and the levels that are allowable in swimming. And it is a huge order of magnitude. And according to the DEP, there have not been any levels detected in Mill Creek that are dangerous for people interacting with that water in a recreational way. Now, I'm not an engineer. This is the data that we need to have in our community. And we need to have a better delineation of the entire plume and its impacts, not just on water supply, but ecologically in general. And we're working with the DEP on that. And I just want to assure any of the Yarmouth residents that are here, it's going to be a primary focus. I mean, we are, number one, working on the public water supply to ensure the safety, and we're implementing PFAS strategies from other sources to protect that public water supply. But we're also pushing that ecological issue in terms of any potential threats to residents. But if you're not drinking the water, the DEP tells us at this point that that is a major piece of it. So that's just a little bit of update. But I want to say anyone in Yarmouth, whether it's Lori or my office, we're available pretty much 24/7 to talk about these issues, to work with the DEP. And that's our primary focus right now. Number one, public water supply wells. Number two, getting more testing in the Mill Creek area so that we can determine, and it can be stated that the threat there is not one that people should be very concerned about or should be concerned about. We need more data.
Thank you very much. I have a question, Brian, this might not be your area. I'm confused. The airport's trying to be a good citizen. The airport uses the airspace over many towns, especially the town of Yarmouth. You've indicated that your responsibility starts and stops as far as the directional flow of these plumes at the airport. We just heard from a representative, I believe from the town of Barnstable, who used the word our, us, and them, which means here we are, we just happen to live in Yarmouth, we're victims. You stood up, sir, representing the town of Barnstable, and made yourself out as a victim. That is, there's a problem you're trying to correct and remediate, and you're looking for money. Who the hell is protecting all of us? As long as an airport attracts planes, which uses airspace, which is regulated by the federal government, everyone who's impacted ought to have the data. You're doing a great job, by the way. I want you to know that. You're helping us see it's a bigger problem than the airport being a good citizen or the town of Barnstable trying to collect some money out of a cheap county over rectifying a problem. We're all suffering. You use the airport. You're the consultant who represents the airport. Can't you help us here in the town of Yarmouth? What can you do?
So I
Your
think,
data is invaluable.
and it has been used to identify for, I can speak to the PFAS aspect. The other aspect about the airspace is not my area of expertise, but for the PFAS aspect of it, the Massachusetts contingency plan requires that you delineate the nature and extent of your plume. And that's what the airport did. We're following the regulation. And then to remediate and abate and address health issues. So we know that our concentration, our highest concentration as it moves towards the receptors, which is Mar Wells, and then into Mill Creek, is at a concentration that's not going to pose a risk. So our plume extent that you see going into Mill Creek is projected to be 10 nanograms per liter for the Mass DEP sum of 6. That's half of what the Mass Department of Public Health has as their swimming water guidance value, which is 23 nanograms per liter, specific to 3 or 4 of the regulated compounds, not the 6, each one individually. So we already know that from a risk perspective standpoint, the airport's plume isn't at a risk to people. Drinking water would have been the major risk, but that's being treated. And then what we identified was that there are all of these other plumes that we don't know exactly where they're coming from, if they're all related to the Barnstable Fire Training Academy or for others, or even how far they go. So we've been providing that information to Mass DEP in the hopes that this will be given to other appropriate parties so that they can do their part and do their investigation, because it is a widespread problem and it should be addressed by who needs to do further investigation. So I think that stuff is in the works. I think a lot of what the airport did was identify that there's a major problem here. It's not, a simple, the airport has this plume and it impacted everything. It's the airport has a PFAS plume, but there's an existing PFAS or multiple PFAS plumes that are very large, that are all converging down at the same area, that need to be addressed by others.
Brian, that sounds all well and good. However, the concentration of PFAS in Mill Creek is over 100 nanograms per liter.
I believe it's, I have a slide to it, it's around 200, I believe.
Okay.
Yep, and it's...
So we're talking about a significant level, and it's not going to get diluted out.
Again,
That's not the way PFAS works.
So again, that's because there's other uncontrolled sources. So what happens is, if you have an uncontrolled source, so the airport capped its source, so the concentrations go. If there's other PFAS plumes and sources and they continue to leach, the concentration will never go away.
Right.
It's going to continue to increase. So the hope is that by providing this information, other sources will be identified and then dealt with. But the PFAS impacts that are at Mill Creek predate the airport and aren't consistent with the airport. It's from another source. And I agree that when the Harvard study did their test in 2018, those concentrations exceeded the regulatory threshold. There was a second round of testing done in 2019 that was significantly different than the first round of testing, where the concentration dropped to much less than 20 nanograms per liter. So I don't know, what does that mean? I don't know where the samples were collected because they don't give those details, but the concentrations were there. So it may be that the first sample was collected from one area and then the second sample was collected from a completely different area in Mill Creek. I'm not sure where they are. But
Actually, we do know exactly where they were collected, and
Okay.
if you need that information, we can give that to you. I have another comment in that, and this is kind of being repetitive, but this seems to be such an overwhelming issue with so many different sources, and the cost, I would presume, is going to be astronomical. Why aren't we seeking out some relief in terms of Superfund so that none of you have to waste any more money on forensics and start solving the problem?
I mean, I think that that's a possibility. EPA is still in the process of making PFOA and PFAS a hazardous substance. And if that happens, it would go into Superfund. Right now, they've kind of kicked the can down the road. It hasn't happened as of yet, but that's a possibility. But that may be years down the road. So I think right now, everybody is, doing the best that they can. The risk is really the drinking water aspect of it. That's being abated. All of the towns have systems in place. From the ecological risk standpoint, again, it's an emerging contaminant. We're not exactly sure, what the levels need to be. But again, that investigation needs to happen by others who are responsible.
I had a quick question. To her point, this is not part of you guys' study. It's a huge problem. But has Massachusetts had a class action lawsuit against, like, say, 3M, like typical to other states to help fund this?
I don't have details on that. I'm not sure.
And also, they say that it's going to be a regulated contaminant in the next
It's on the
year.
books. It was supposed to happen this year. They put those in play in, I want to say 2019 or so. They proposed it, and it's kind of gone its way through the regulatory agencies, and then they gave themselves another year. But it probably will happen.
Drinking water was supposed to be the end of this year or January 24. They received over 100 million comments, so they're kicking it down the road another 10 months.
So just to respond to your question that you just asked about the class action suit, Barnstable is part of that against 3M. So we've been privy to that with our attorneys here in the town.
Quick question. This is clearly a regional problem. What is the county doing? Are they taking a leadership role in this?
So the county, what Dan was saying earlier, is Mass DEP has proposed a technical summit between the airports, their environmental consultant, Horsley Witten, between the county, their environmental consultant, DPW, to sit down and address these things. I think that initially it wasn't realized maybe how big of a regional problem this is. One of the slides I haven't got to yet is PFAS and soil background. So when we were doing all of this investigation, it was becoming very difficult to figure out, well, every place we test, there's PFAS. Let's go take samples in the woods off airport property, and you'll see I have a map where we collected PFAS samples from throughout this area. And more than 50% of the samples exceeded the regulatory standards when there's no known release. And it kind of goes back to, these are ubiquitous in the environment. It's in all of our consumer products, so we may be a part of the problem as well. Just from our regular consumer shampoos and our car waxes and kind of all those things going out. That's part of the problem too. I think, let me see if I can find the slide. So all of these locations right up here, we went and we collected PFAS samples. So here, the airport's the blue line. And if you see just a blue dot, that means it didn't exceed for any of the regulatory values. So we've got, a bunch of samples throughout the airport. We had one sample that exceeded, and it wasn't consistent with the airport's firefighting foam. It was consistent with the other background samples. And when you look, we have samples out here that have nothing to do with the airport and that all have detectable levels of PFAS that exceed regulatory thresholds. These are collected from samples in the woods where there's no known release. And again, it goes back to there's atmospheric deposition of PFAS. There's all other sources that can be adding to this problem.
I'd like to get out of the woods for a second, and I'm not sure exactly, how this evening's event will be resolved, but I think, it shows that there's quite a lot of interest and community interest in these things. And I guess I would just point out that, the airport does have a public information plan that was, I guess, required by DEP through the MCP that would have you put public meetings together. And you did a phase 3 report and there was no public meeting. You did a phase 4 draft, no public meeting. A phase 4 final, no public meeting. And now I heard you say that you're going to be submitting your final report and you'll be all done. And this is not even a public information plan meeting. So there really is an interest that goes beyond, and it's just obviously it's beyond the airport. It's the Fire Training Academy and the amount of PFAS in the creeks and the ponds all around Hyannis, and so when we also talk about a technical meeting up on high, I think those types of things should be open to the public. I think Linda's indicated, maybe we should have a Superfund site, but maybe it won't ever get there. But I think the responsible parties and the villages and towns that we're in should try to be more. I wouldn't say more transparent. I would just say to accept that we have a great interest in trying to resolve this thing, and it seems like it's regional. So I don't know how this will be resolved, but I just wanted to get that off my chest.
Sure.
That,
In the
I
airport,
think we need to have more public meetings on this type of thing.
the airport does have a public and. I just wanted to respond. So the airport does have the PIP plan in place, and the airport did hold its initial meeting, I want to say back in 2019, and the agreement that was in place was that we have an ongoing PIP list, and every time there's a phased report, it goes out to public comment for 30 days, which we've been doing. Town of Yarmouth is on that list. They get notifications of all of our phased reports. There's about 100 people that are on the list, and they go out. Mass DEP is also one of our PIP participants, so they're reviewing our work as well. And it goes out for a 30-day comment so that anybody in the public can comment, can give their thoughts. Mass DEP can as well, and then it's addressed. And periodically, just like this meeting, this isn't associated with the PIP. This is just providing information to other folks who may not be on the PIP list. A couple comments, not many.
And that's one of the reasons why we're holding this meeting today, so that we can sit in front of all of our community that is interested in PFAS and to provide some additional information. We did this at the airport in September as well. Again, an extra meeting just to make sure that the community was aware of what was happening, what the airport was doing. We held that in September, and we had a tour of the airfield so they could actually physically go out to the airfield and look at the mitigation sites and identify with the mitigation and the capping that the airport has done. So again, this is our way of reaching out to the public to say, yet again, here's where we are. We're a little bit more advanced than we were in September, so we're providing the community today with that public information. You had a question?
Yes, I do. I am also concerned that has been said that a lot of the presentation tonight was enlightening, but it was enlightening that the viewpoint of the airport is that, well, there's a lot of other people creating this problem. Yet, certainly, we are acknowledging, and am I correct, that the airport is a contributing factor? First question. Second question is, what activities of the airport will contribute further to PFAS in the environment
in the water or the ground going forward?
So to answer the first part of your question, the airport's plume did impact groundwater, and that's what's shown on that. And that was from the airport's use of aqueous film forming foam. So the airport has the aqueous film forming foam, also known as AFFF, for usage in life-saving requirements if there's a fire. That's why they have it. The airport stopped using the foam in 2015 in training, and the only time it will be used on the airport is in the event of an emergency where life-saving is necessary. So the airport does have AFFF. It is not used or trained with anymore, but it is on hand in the event that there's an emergency. I think in one of the previous pictures I had, the last time there was an incident at the airport, and the airport will remediate. So if there's an accident, there's a distinct area where firefighting foam is used, there can be an appropriate response to that. So if there was another accident at some point and AFFF needed to be used, the airport would go into environmental site assessment mode after life-saving, which is obviously the first priority, has been taken care of. Then the second step would be to mitigate so that we don't get a problem going forward. So to answer your question, the airport historic use of AFFF did impact groundwater. They stopped training with it and using it in the deployment area back in 2015, 2016. And the only time it will be used on the airport is if there's an emergency.
And to answer your question about future PFAS, the FAA, this is the only type of foam that we can use that the FAA has allowed, but they are investigating PFAS-free foams that are eligible for airports to use. So right now, this is our only alternative, which is why we've changed the way that we operate in regards to our response. Obviously, like Brian said, if there's an incident that requires it, basically it's a fire. If there's a fire, the foam and water mixture is used to blanket that fire and put it out. The FAA is looking at alternatives. They're still investigating it. We are waiting patiently for companies that can supply that type of PFAS-free foam to get certified from the FAA. As once that happens, then what we have to do is investigate that ourselves, make sure that our equipment can handle that or make modifications and changes. But the community, the aviation community, is looking at that as a possibility, knowing that going into the future, we have to make a change. I think we had one more question. That's the intent. So obviously, like Brian said, the first phase of that is life safety, making sure that that is taken care of. In this particular incident here, because our team was already aware of the PFAS issue with the firefighting foam, as soon as this happened, they deployed, our 2 firefighters deployed foam. One of them got out of the truck and put a cap over our catch basin immediately. So they just know that. They're trained to know that. Obviously, it depends on where an incident were to occur. It depends on what we have to do, but they're trained to be able to protect the airport as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Tom was saying and the gentleman behind me, and I guess to some degree what Dan Santos was saying, that we need to be more in the open with this. It's been handled too quietly. And I know I went to the last county meeting, and they hold it on what, Microsoft Teams or something? Again, it's not in person. It's only Zoom-ish, but it's not Zoom. And when they presented, they said, oh, yeah, no, we're just getting to the west of the airport. And I said to them, I said, these PFAS has a decade's head start on you. How can you possibly be just west of the airport? I mean, that's, again, like I used the word before, that's absurd. And, you know, perhaps... And then you used the word hope. You said you send the data to the DEP in the hope that they'll do the right thing. Well, hope is not a very good strategy. And I was wondering if, again, what Tom was saying, could we perhaps have a joint meeting in front of people where you present and the county presents together, so they can't just say, oh, we've had all these problems, we're just to the west. Well, clearly they're not to the west because you have all this data that's gone to the DEP in hope of something. So, and then this summit, that should be, I agree with Tom, that should be in the public too. because, maybe not your plume, but their plume impacted me. I took part in the PFAS study. I drank the water for 10 years. I have very high levels of PFAS, extremely high. And, what am I supposed to do? So it's not a theoretical thing. There's a ton of us. I wish more people had participated in the study. They didn't, unfortunately, but I did. So why don't we get more out in the open with this, get the two of you guys together and present so they can see, like we're all seeing on these slides. We have the data. Do something. It just, Tom's been at these meetings too. I mean, for those of us who go to all these meetings, it's again, absurd seems the only word that's appropriate.
Thank you. And thank you. And, the point of tonight's meeting was to show the extent of the airport's plume. Obviously, from hearing all of you, we know that this is a problem that affects many more people. We needed to make sure that you were aware of what constituted the airport's impact to the region. We've done that. We're still providing more data, collecting more data to provide that. But you're correct. It's a problem that takes over much more than just the airport. It's coming on site and coming down southeast from the airport, from many other industrial sites as well. So yes, it is a problem. We're just trying to identify what is the airport's contribution to this. We will make sure that we do what we have to do for the airport contribution, but it is a much larger conversation to have with the folks at DEP. Brian? Yeah.
Can Brian finish?
Oh, yes.
You have more information. Why don't you just run through what you
Go through it.
you prepared it, and I want to hear it.
Sure. So I think this is where I left off. This is the plume from a three-dimensional aspect. So you've been seeing it as this shape right here. So this is what it looks like if you were to look at it on the side. And these are based on wells that are screened multiple depths. So I have wells that are in the shallow groundwater, which would be 5 feet into groundwater. Then I have wells that are 20 feet into groundwater, 50 feet, 100 feet into groundwater. So I can see what this plume looks like at different intervals, and I can track it as it moves away from the airport. So this area in gray, these are the higher concentrations of the plume. So these are concentrations that are, 10, 20 times regulatory standard. This is the regulatory standard's 0.02. So the stuff that you see in this gray would be 10 times that drinking water standard. That's not total PFAS. This is the sum of 6 regulatory values. So based on our highest concentration that we had detected, we used that in our model to be ultra conservative. So we said the highest concentration that we've ever had, we're going to assume it's always been that concentration, and we're going to run our model and do it a couple different ways. We use the USGS model. It incorporates pumping rates at the Mar wells, and we also did a substantial hydrogeologic investigation to figure out time travel. So you can see that the plume is very high in the deployment area, and as it starts to move with groundwater, the concentrations are basically getting diluted. So more groundwater that wasn't from AFFF impacts. So stuff that now that we've capped our source, and this happens because we capped our source. If we capped the source, this would never happen. The gray would continue to go and go and go and go. But when the airport capped its source, it basically stopped the further leaching of impacted PFAS into groundwater and allowed dilution to occur, where you have cleaner water that's coming in, and you have your concentration, spread out here. This is the higher concentration. This stuff that you see in red, that's the part of the plume as it continues to exceed the drinking water standard. The stuff that's in yellow is as it goes away. So you can see as it hits Marwell 2 right on the edge, it's just less than the drinking water standard. And then as it continues to go this way, it's dropping to 50% of the drinking water standard. So the higher concentrations, it's capped, so it's not leaching anymore. So let me fast. This is a 3-dimensional view of it. So this is kind of a graphical depiction of what happened. These are the caps. Maybe I'll start with that. So this is the polyethylene cap that the airport installed on the deployment area. So the airport did substantial investigation. We identified this as the source. So you can see this entire area, this whole area that's not even capped yet. This was where they sprayed foam and the airport down this polyethylene cap. It's continuous. It's field welded in place, and it's a water migration mitigation effort. And we redirected all of the storm water outside of these areas so that it wasn't going into the plume to continue to charge it. So now, here's the concentration. This is before we did the plume. And you can see the concentration's continuing to go up. This is the source is leaching, and it's actively leaching. This red line represents when we installed the cap. You can see that almost immediately, within a couple months, the concentrations dropped substantially. Total PFAS went down substantially. Again, you can also see that what's really driving this is the green. So this blue is the sum of all the 40 PFAS analytes that DEP is regulating. I'm sorry, the blue is the sum of all 40 analytes that the labs are reporting. This green one is the 6,2 fluorotoler. So you can see the 6,2 fluorotoler is a major contribution to total PFAS. This one down here is what Mass DEP is regulating. And again, this whole area already has PFAS that's exceeding the drinking water standard that's coming onto the airport that's not even the airport source. So when the cap was installed, you could see 6,2 fluorotoler, which is consistent with the airport's plume, immediate drop. Couple ups and downs, that's normal. So what happens is there's a source area sitting in groundwater, and as the groundwater table goes up and down, it's leaching out that final portion that's in the smear zone. And you can see that these ups and downs are correlating with groundwater. That's going to happen over a couple cycles, and then you get to where you have these much lower concentrations. So every time there's a rebound, it drops even more, goes up, drops even more. So now we're kind of at the point where we've seen a substantial reduction. We test it every 6 months. We tested it 2 months ago. This data is from I think it's 5/2023. That's the last data point that's right there. 4. We test it every 6 months. And we're going to continue to test it every 6 months. So we're proving that this cap has worked. And what we do is down gradient. So this cap is this monitoring well is immediately down gradient of the cap. So it's showing that the cap has worked. And then we monitor wells that are further down gradient to show that those concentrations are also dropping. There's no in situ treatment. So when the airport was evaluating the remediation options, again, it's an emerging contaminant, and there's not really many treatment options. There's excavate, dig and haul, send your material to a landfill. Some of these landfills aren't designed to have the type of capping system. This is a very special polyethylene cap made for PFAS. PFAS leaches much differently through various types of cap material. So a liner that was installed at a landfill 15 years ago has a different diffusion coefficient than this material does. It was specifically made for this purpose.
Do you happen to know what kind of cap is at the Fire Training Academy?
I'm not sure. I don't know if they have their sources controlled. Did they cap everything?
They tore the building down and they capped the site.
It originally wasn't.
I understand also at the Martha's Vineyard Airport that they are piloting a permeable reactive barrier within the aquifer to in situ to provide attenuation of the PFAS as it's moving. So it's kind of a barrier to
We evaluated that, actually, that option as part of our phase 3. So that's a micro activated carbon that they inject. It's called Plume Stop. I'm not sure what material that Martha's Vineyard is using, but I know of a material because we evaluated it called Regenesis. We evaluated that where you inject carbon into the groundwater, and as a plume goes through this carbon, it's attracted to the carbon and the carbon holds it. Now, there's 2 problems from our perspective with that option, is that at some point the carbon becomes overwhelmed. If you have no source control, The carbon can only hold so much PFAS contamination, and then it stops working. And then you have a PFAS source that's going to sit there and continue to leach at some point. It could. So we did evaluate it, and the reason that we didn't implement it was its proximity to Mar wells. So to do an injection that made sense would have to be closer to Mar wells, not right at the airport property, because the source is already gone. So we would have to do injections in proximity to Mar wells, and we thought that those injections would most likely cause a problem to Mar wells, where it would either get pulled in by the cone of depression of Mar well. And we also evaluated a pump and treat system and felt that we'd be pulling more water away. But we did evaluate that during our remedial options and found that the best solution was to use the cap and have treatment at the Mar wells, because the plume stop would cause more of a problem than its benefit.
The plume that's coming from the fire training facility, at what depth does it hit the north shore of the airport?
I've got it stacked in multiple depths. So we've got, let me go back to this picture. There's two groups of monitoring wells that are right here. So groundwater is flowing this direction. I've got PFAS detections all the way down to, I want to say, 60, 80 feet plus. I have it in the shallow, a little bit deeper, and then very deep, which again indicates that there's been, and I know that there's been treatment systems that have been going on, and there's the ponds, but it's been detected at all levels out there.
Can we hope and assume that pretty soon, every hour early in the morning, we don't have to listen to that noise pollution that you are giving us, and all of the contrails and everything that's falling down on all of us? Everyone who swims in the creek is sick, including me. And I didn't swim, I walked in.
So from the PFAS aspect of it, the airport is doing what it's required for its PFAS release. So that's what they've investigated. And we've provided the information so that others who may be contributing sources can start to do their own investigation to delineate it. So the airport is doing what they need to do consistent with the Massachusetts contingency plan and is dealing with their release and has identified these other sources and provided that information. As for the other things that you were speaking of, those are outside of my expertise.
I think what we're trying to show here is we know that there's a source from the airport. We've identified that source. There are sources that are coming onto the airport property that are from non-airport sources. Obviously, it's not passing the buck. We do know that there's other entities that contribute to this. The airport is doing what we need to do to rectify our impact and the impact that has been caused by the use of firefighting foam. That's what we're showing you this evening. I think, Brian, in the interest of time, I know we've been here for 2 hours. I don't know if you have any other slides that you really wanted to get to that you didn't have a moment to get to, but I think we have to start wrapping up. And obviously, I think we should plan for another check-in meeting with the public as we get further along, as we're able to deliver that Phase 5 report that's coming up, that we can have another moment to have a meeting with the public and also take some information that came from tonight's meeting in regards to working with DEP. Obviously, we have our airport plume that we're associated with, but obviously it's a bigger problem.
I think that, a couple of the main things that we wanted to point out was that, we've already discussed those. This is a regional problem. There's a large PFAS problem in this area. The airport has identified its portion of it and is addressing its portion of it. They've tried to bring in other parties by notifying Mass DEP and giving them this information and telling them that we have these other sources. Fire Training Academy will be getting this information as well so that they can delineate. As for the caps, I know that there was some questions about how these are constructed. This is, what these photographs are of. This is, what that cap looked like. This is the larger cap, the polyethylene sheeting, the geomembrane cap. This is the ARF building area. This is a much smaller cap, so this area is not as impacted as the deployment area. So the release that occurred here was related to some, or likely some incidental spillage occurring inside of this building to floor drains that were connected to a dry well that was in this area that had been abandoned. Also, this area used to be grass and, washing of equipment afterwards. So this was a much smaller, intermittent, not as substantial source as what the deployment area was. And this material was used as an asphalt cap. And again, there's monitoring that's done here as well.
Can I ask you, at what phase in the MCP did you install the cap?
We installed the cap well before we were even done with our phase 2. So once we identified where this area was in 2022, we were still in the process of doing our phase 2 work. We did it as an interim measure because we identified this and we knew that this was our source. So it was a way to mitigate the known source while we continued our investigation, because we still didn't put all the pieces together. We knew where the impacts were in soil. We knew that there was a groundwater issue, but we were trying to put our arms around the extent of it, because in the beginning, without the forensics, it was extremely difficult. If you just look at Mass DEP sum of 6, there's no way to figure out who's responsible other than there's PFAS everywhere. So it took us some time to kind of figure it out and forensically look at the airport's analytical data and the Fire Training Academy's analytical data and the data from Mill Creek and try to put all the pieces together. So this was done well before that.
Can an engineer reasonably install a cap that's engineered correctly without phase 1 complete?
Yes, it would be done as an IRA, an immediate response action, which is how this was done. So this cap was engineered and designed and submitted in an IRA report to Mass DEP that gave the means and methods for how we would install it. Then the cap was installed by a qualified installer who installs geomembrane. That's what they do with oversight from us, from the engineers.
But the exact type of cap needs to be informed by data, correct? You can't just go out there and you wouldn't have picked this.
This was
and have
chosen,
some data.
Absolutely. You would want to know where your source areas are so that you can strategically cap them. So if you just haphazardly put a cap there, it may or may not help. Also, it takes some time if you don't control infiltration. So this specific area, we redirected surface water flow that it wouldn't specifically recharge our plume. So there was a lot of engineering that went into this because we knew here's where our soil source area is, and we want to do everything that we can so that groundwater, so that rainwater doesn't infiltrate in this area. So when we capped it, we also made it so that it redirected groundwater from away from these areas. But it takes a fair amount of effort to know. You need to know where the source is.
Well, I'm just curious, and again, talking about the Fire Training Academy, that they have this cap, but you said they're still in phase 1.
They're still doing their ongoing investigation, but I'm not familiar with exactly where they capped and if it's truly their source areas or if they capped some of it. The caps really only work when you cap your entire source. If you cap a piece of it, it will help, but if you still have leaching, the problem's not going to stop. You may... if you capped 20% of the problem, you still have another 80%. And if you didn't address how stormwater infiltrates, you're just going to keep recharging it. So again, it goes back to how much information they had to actually put the cap in the right place. And I don't know if they capped the entire parcel and what did they do about Flint Rock Pond. Flint Rock Pond, if it has PFAS impacts in its sediment, will be an ongoing source, even if you cap the asphalt area.
Yeah.
So it all goes into what did they do for their investigation to determine the extent of their impacts, and was it appropriate enough to control a source? And the distance that they're away, too, even if they cap today, there's still a considerable amount of contamination because of the distance that it's going to take for it to go away, because the airport is much closer to Marwell. The fire department is the Fire Training Academy is much further away and has a much higher concentrated slug that's already in the ground that's going to continue to move. If they capped appropriately and removed the source, the plume will detach somewhat like ours did and concentrations will go down, but that's only dependent on the source being controlled.
Okay. And I just wanted to compliment Katie's service on this evening's format. This has been amazing. And I really wish the county would do this, and that's why I'm encouraging, perhaps you could reach out to the county and we could have a joint presentation, because so much of your presentation is tied to their plume, and there's a lot of finger pointing. And I think if we had a conversation like you have, and Katie, this has been fantastic, because we've had so much interaction here and really good information. I really appreciate it. So much better than the standard way that, you know, you do a presentation and then you stand up and sometimes 3 minutes, you know, which is, it doesn't work. And this has, I think, I don't know if the other folks, I think some of the applause has said that yes, people agree, but I would really encourage, I don't know who reaches out, if it's the town of Barnstable, the town of Yarmouth together to the county, and you guys put together something together when we can really have a conversation about this. Thank you, Katie. Thank you.
I had promised several people who've had to leave that they actually really did appreciate this conversation about PFAS. But one of the other environmental issues they're having a lot of concerns about, given there's a lot more information appearing in the news and the press about the emissions from jet fuel. And that issue of what is that's falling down on us. And I don't know if there'll be an opportunity. They were raising the question, is there going to be an opportunity where some of those other kinds of environmental issues from the airport will also get addressed in a way like this was? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for asking that. Our next meeting that deals with the environmental assessment is October 18th. There's going to be a virtual portion of that will be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So whatever your pleasure is, virtual or in person, the in-person will be at 6 o'clock. We'll be discussing that. You may have also saw in the recent news this weekend about a smart grid program that the airport is embarking on with MassDOT and the Cape Cod RTA to look at electric aviation recharging stations at the facility that would also help ground transportation as well as aviation.
As part of your wrap-up, you mentioned, first of all, the slideshow. We haven't seen a lot of the slides. Can you put them up on the airport website or on your website?
Yes. Yep. As Katie said, they have a portion of their website that's dedicated to PFAS.
And the other thing actually was similar to what Ms. Ledke was mentioning. You had talked about a technical group that are going to get together of different parties. Is the public going to have access to that or access to the information afterwards? And if not, would that be a good time to have the county and the airport and other entities get together and make a joint presentation to the public?
I can answer that, Brian. I think the upcoming meeting, I think, is just an internal meeting right now. However, I will be reaching out to the folks at DEP to have them watch this. This will be on demand, so they can get the sense of where the community is coming from just a response standpoint. And I'm sure we'll talk about that at our next internal meeting with them. Okay.
Sorry to ask or have a technical point, but yeah, first the cap at the Fire Training Academy is exclusive. I mean, throughout the whole thing. So they did do that, and they did it, in their phase 1 as an immediate response action. The thing on Brian is that the concentration you use for the modeling from your sources was 200 nanograms per liter or something like that? Or
no, that's the concentration at the Fire Training Academy. Our concentration is 1.
All right, 1.2 nanograms per liter as your source for the model, and we're aware that when AFFF is applied in training with the water, the concentrations are probably 100 million nanograms per liter when it's applied, or when it has been applied in the past, and so 100 million that gets applied could very well result in some really high concentrations very rapidly, because it's only a a single episodic application and then naturally degrade and have the concentrations go down. And actually, we've seen that at the Fire Training Academy, where concentrations of 300,000 now are down around 10,000. So there may be another explanation for the reduction of PFAS other than the cap, and that's what I just want to throw out there.
Okay. I'd like to thank everyone, thank Brian especially for his presentation. Brian and his team at Horsley Witten Group have been working with us long and hard to identify the airport sources. So thank you, Brian, for being here. Thank you, everyone else. Thank you for your questions. We will have another meeting to give you an update on PFAS alone. We'll keep PFAS and the EA for the airport separate so that we can concentrate on the areas that are of concern to our community. And we don't have a date yet for that next meeting. It will most likely be closer to the time when we have the Phase 5 report that's going to be delivered to DEP, the draft. So probably in between the draft and the final would be most appropriate. I know that most people like to meet in this room. The availability for the AV system is a lot better than what we have at the airport, which is why we try to use this room when we have a public meeting so everybody can see the screen. I'm not adverse to doing another tour of the airfield after a meeting like this so that you can see the location of the mitigation site. We might have to split that up. It might have to be a day meeting and then followed by, so you can see the site in the daylight. We'll have to figure that out. Maybe we'll have a sign-up sheet for those that are interested in coming to the airport for a tour. But thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.